Welcome to this presentation of research results and discussion and engagement with you all stakeholders from EuroDIG. I'm here presenting a project together with my colleague Jakob Bund, who you see online, and we'll be joined by discussants who will comment on the initial results. And the first part is going to be me talking about a little bit about what REMIT is. You might be wondering. Then we'll be having three different, three different results presentations of different kinds, from different work packages within that EU project, and then we'll have time to discuss. So the idea is the first 15, 20 minutes presentation, and then there will be discussion questions, and obviously the wonderful discussants will react. What is REMIT? Who has heard of the project before coming to EuroDIG? Nobody. That's good. That's fantastic. Online, some people, I know some people from this project are here. Fantastic. REMIT is, and now I have to get started again. REMIT is a Horizon Europe project, which is a funding line by European Union to develop knowledge, scientific knowledge, but also to create innovations, in this case, public policy innovations. It's a 4-year project. It's now in its second year. The coordinator is Professor Roberta Haar, as you see here. It started with 20 researchers. Now we have more than 40. And the first half of the project will be generating research results, whereas in the second half, we'll be using those research results in order to create recommendations for the European Union and engage with stakeholders. The project partners are 8 different partners. You can see here on the 9 different partners, you can see on the slide. Among them, University of Bremen, from where I hail, and ECRI, where Jakob Bund is from, and other universities and think tanks across Europe. REMIT has specific goals that it's set out. It's a response essentially to an EU call to reform the EU's approach to multilateralism. And when we talk about multilateralism more generally, here we often call this multi-stakeholder. We go beyond it, if you will, in terms of openness. But that was an EU call to create knowledge and to make recommendations for the European Union. That is for different institutions of the EU, but also for different national governments, whoever is part of governance of technology in the European Union. We do so in 4 different technology areas, and we'll talk here mostly about digital technology because that's what EuroDIG is all about. Come on in, welcome. But we also, in principle, engaging questions of medical governance or medical technology, for example, biomedical and security and defense, but that's not so much myself in my area. And this is not what we're going to talk about here at EuroDIG. The project structure is essentially in 3 substantive work packages, of which we will be talking mostly about work package 3 and 5 here. You can see them in this concentric circle approach, whereas work package 3 creates the normative or creates knowledge about the normative construction of technology governance. Work package 5 deals with deliberations on the economic and social realm of technology governance. All these things are quite central also, I think, to the mission of EuroDIG and the EuroDIG community. The middle work packages deals more, and we'll come to this, with geopolitics. So work package 3, of which I am the work package lead. Here's a photo how we met. Works both with empirical social science research, but also legal research on the normative foundations of technology governance, again, in those different areas, again, with a focus on digital technology. We ask you questions: what are the norms and values of stakeholders, of populations, of policymakers of the EU, and so on. Work package 4 works on the understanding of normative elements and strategic competition, geopolitical competition. It focuses on the big players, China, the United States, and the European Union, more from an internal perspective, looks at how is actually strategy being made, for example, in those actors, going beyond what work package 3 does, which is a much more global approach. Work package 5 aims to understand the social and economic impacts and debates. It looks at specific technologies, so rather than, say, work package 3 looking at the entire society, entire debate. It looks at specific technologies such as blockchain, such as artificial intelligence, and so on. How do we reach out, and how do we make this knowledge available for a broader set of stakeholders? We had just our first conference, apart from going to places like EuroDIG, obviously, we just had our first conference in Leuven at the KU Leuven University in May, where we had 8,200 different participants joining us from different stakeholder groups, mostly academics, but also people from the Brussels EU institutions or NATO. If you want to engage in the future with REMIT, and if you, after those presentations today, think, oh, this is interesting, I want to follow them, there are different opportunities. Obviously, we have a website. We'll have at some point, we already have quite some content. There will be podcasts, there will be more visually appealing ways of sharing data. You can also subscribe to the newsletter. We'll be having conferences, we'll be engaging at policy conferences like EuroDIG and the IGF, but also we'll be conducting so-called scenario testing workshops in the coming years, starting in 2025. So if you find this particularly interesting, particularly if you're a policymaker, join us for one of those scenario testing workshops where we develop with you recommendations based on our findings. What we'll be presenting to you today is 3 substantive early findings from our research, mapping normative discourses and global digital governance. This is something that you all have some idea of, I think. Results from a comparative analysis of national strategies, particularly also inputs to the GDC process, state inputs to the GDC process from Jakob Bund, and exploring the EU partners' public attitudes to European digital governance. This is the 3rd presentation. Sorry, this.
Sorry, I have a small technical problem.
I realized that.
Perfect. Yeah.
Better? Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. And the 3rd presentation I'll be giving, this is a pilot study and pilot study results from Georgia. But this is a survey that's going to be extended to 12 countries in total, talking about public attitudes toward EU policymaking in the digital realm. And we'll be joined by 3 wonderful discussants who agreed, although you didn't have the results before anyone else, like anyone else can react as much as you can, but have agreed to actually give an impromptu reaction to our findings. We have Anna Neves, who is the vice chair of the 28th,
The CSTD.
The 28th committee, the 28th CSTD, okay, of the UN. Sophie Zwaveladze is the deputy head of the Department of Communication, Information and Modern Technologies Department of the Ministry of Economy and Sustainable Development of Georgia. And Pilar Rodriguez, Peter, which one is it? Both.
Yeah.
Fine. Rodriguez Peter. EuroDIG, org team, EuroDIG 2023. Youth IGF Spain, or I think also IGF Spain, not sure, and the Polytechnic University of Madrid. We'll also be joined by online moderator, Isabel Alvaro Alonso from the Youth IGF Spain. Okay, and with that being said, I'm going to start and go right ahead in the first presentation. All these presentations, as you see, are timed. So I have 30 seconds per slide. So I'm going to have to talk fast. But it also means we're not going to get over time because of that, hopefully. So the first one is a mapping of normative discourse on global digital governance. What we did as part of this project is to map certain documents that entail normative standards and normative claims in debates of global digital governance. Global digital governance discourse entails all kinds of claims about norms about how digital governance ought to be. The debates that are taking place at international conferences like EuroDIG or IGF, but often they're also written up. This discourse has changed over the last 30 years, and it can be studied by studying documents that we call digital bills of rights. These documents entail rights and principles written up in them often decisions being made of what comes first, what comes last, what is included, what is not included. Examples of that include the Carta Portuguesa de Derechos Humanos na Era Digital. I mean, I've butchered that one, but you've been quite familiar with that one, obviously, Anna. But also the African Declaration of Rights and Freedoms, the Net Mundial Stakeholder Statement, can be guidelines on artificial intelligence, or the Toronto Declaration on AI and machine learning. So a wide array of these kind of documents. Why do we call them digital bills of rights? Because they place rights very central vis-a-vis public and private power holders, and they give us as humans, as communities, as individuals, certain rights. And as Eduardo Celeste writes, they have a jargon of constitutions very often. They resemble constitutions. They have all these principles listed, and they entail these rights and obligations for individuals and giving individuals rights. So as a research question, what are the research questions about this specific project? It is to understand that discourse over 30 years. How is the discourse structured? So, who's part of it? Are the different layers, are the different centers? What kind of discourse coalitions can we actually make out in this data set that we have? And lastly, which principles are affiliated with which actors in this network? We created a data set over the past few years. This was finalized in this EU project. It has 321 documents ranging from 1992 to 2023. They relate to internet, digital, but also AI and platform governance. We hand-coded them, 69 substantive process principles and metadata, and we collaborated with the Digital Constitutionalist Network to do so. This data set will also be published this year, so you can have a look at it. How does it look like? It's a little bit small here, perhaps for you, but what we can see here is that these documents have come up early, but only in 2009, 2010 have they really come through, and many of these documents were produced. We can also see that some actors only started quite late. Government actors got involved post-Snowden. 2015 is a year where many governments issued these kind of documents. Private actors, same thing. And civil society actors are the ones who have produced most of these documents. If we look at geographical locations for these documents, we see that most of them have been produced in Europe or in global, the Net Mundial statement, produced in a global fashion or with global participation. And many other, like these documents, including UN documents. But we see also quite a bit in North America, Asia, Africa, and less so in the Middle East and South America. You see also certain stakeholders have been more active than others in specific regions. When we now look at, so in these documents, what do you have? All these principles and rights, what are the most common ones? This is the top 10. Here you see for the time, this is a little bit of a different, smaller data set, 2004 to 2023, the top 10, and how frequent they are over time. So you see some are less frequent today, freedom of information, for example. Others are more frequent, non-discrimination. So we see also normative change there. But what we're interested mostly is this kind of network that we wanted to create, and we wanted to see which document is actually associated with which actor and which principle and so on. So we created one actor principle network, several, but this is the one we arrived at. And what we did essentially is to, using network mapping, looking at which these are, the smaller dots are all actors, and the gray bigger dots are the principles. It says in a legend, it says docs, but it's not actually, it's actually the principles. You see, for example, if you have very good eyes, it says here freedom of expression or privacy on top. And then you see all the actors who put this very central, this principle, who mentioned that a couple of times, or who have mentioned that, who are part of the same network of people who have co-authored documents, because that's one of the points, is many of these have co-authored documents. Sometimes it's different international organizations co-authoring, very often different companies, different states, different civil society organizations. And we used a clustering algorithm that helped us to understand, okay, so if we see a kind of centrality values, what kind of clusters can we actually make up? And we made out 4 clusters. this is kind of overarching over 30 years. You have to consider they don't coexist. I mean, if you have a room like this, break room, you have people standing in clusters. But this is where people stood over 30 years. So there's obviously, this is a limitation to that. But we can talk about this later. We made up out those 4 different coalitions. The first coalition is the Human Rights and Internet Self-Governance Discourse Coalition. You see here which principles are most often associated. Transparency, human rights, accountability, multi-stakeholderism, open source, right to encryption. So that's one of the clusters. And we have a lot of actors here from civil society, and a lot from Europe, and a lot that are global, like international organizations. The second cluster is the so-called inclusionary rights discourse. So these are rights that include people. For example, cultural diversity, right to access at the bottom, user awareness, user education, all these kind of things. We see a lot of stakeholders from Africa, for example, participating in this civil society, but also governments. And we see rights, as you see the principles on the left, mentioned some of them, being included in this cluster. The third cluster is the security and legitimate use discourse coalition. In this, we have principles such as privacy, data protection, personal security, security of the network, I think, cybersecurity, but also environmental impacts or limited environmental impacts, so to say. And we have a lot of actors here from government in this, in Europe, global, but also North America. You can also see here certain years, because again, this is an intertemporal network. So this is the peak in 2017 for the last of the 4 clusters. This is the content moderation cluster. So 2017, this is obviously after the first Trump election. And this is kind of Cambridge Analytica period. So we got a lot of content moderation issues here. What is very prevalent? Civil society, intergovernmental organizations. And in terms of geography, we got a lot of Europe and global, but we have no single document that has Asia or Africa. Or North America, actually 2 from North America only. So you see a lot of data, and we have this intertemporal discourse or set of discourse or network with 4 different discourse coalitions. And what do we do with this? So what? Some of the conclusions, obviously, I mean, first of all, well, we have a data set now. We'll be sharing this toward the end of the year. It's newly created and hand-coded. It's very searchable. You can have a look at the different documents and can see, can search for documents, for example. There are different discourse coalitions we identified, and we also found that civil society represents about 50% of the actors in this network. We identified top principles like privacy, freedom of information, and freedom of expression. And that's the first presentation already. And now I'm going to hand off to Jakob, just do one after the other.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I'll put my slides up as well.
We can see them now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dennis, first of all, for the opportunity to also share some of our initial research finding for WAC Package 5, specifically the state approaches to critical and emerging technologies that we've been looking into. Recognizing that technology governance may start in national capitals, but is shaped by interactions across multiple levels. For this initial research task, we were interested in developing a comparison of how states frame their approach to strategic digital technologies, both at the national level, but also in a multilateral context. And for this, to understand this, how states frame their outreach to domestic and international audiences, we have reviewed 2 sets of documents. You can see posted here for the first level, a set of national technology strategy documents. Those could be technology, in brackets, diplomacy strategies, but also more specifically strategies oriented towards digital foreign policy, more broadly, if countries have developed those, also critical technology inventories that really provide a very detailed overview of the specific technology areas that fit this definition of digital strategic technology for states. But to develop this comparative perspective, we've also looked at the second level, which provides us with a multilateral anchor for this comparison. Which countries have contributed to the UN Global Digital Compact consultations by ways of an individual position paper submitted to this process. And you can see here, if you take a look at the bar chart on the right-hand side, that there are indeed a number of, no small number, a significant number of governments that have taken part in some shape or form in the UNGDC consultations, but mostly through regional consultation settings. And it is a significantly smaller number of only 13 states that actually have submitted an individual contribution as part of this process. Even though that is a relatively small number, this is an actually quite interesting set of countries. If you start to cluster this a little bit and you look at EU member states that are represented in there, you see that there are also key participants in minilateral settings like the Quad and AUKUS, for instance, but also small but highly digitally dependent economies like Singapore and Switzerland. And also, that is, I think, worth considering with respect to questions of authoritarian abuse of technologies, also countries that, according to the Freedom House ranking, would be classified as not free. Through this review of these technology documents and GDC submissions, we have identified technology clusters for which states have invoked a specific strategic framing. More on these framings in just a moment. But looking at these technologies, you'll see the usual suspects that you would expect to be front and center in these discussions: AI features, quantum technologies, semiconductors, of course, but also special interest applications such as regulatory technology, for instance. As for the strategic framings that we have identified in this review, there were 4 recurrent perspectives that we could make out. There are exploratory framings, as we have termed them, which reflect mainly efforts to foster technological innovation. These are state approaches that highlight economic opportunities to strengthen the domestic industrial base and reduce vulnerabilities in geographically dispersed supply chains. There are consultatory framings, which capture outreach to international partners to identify cost-effective ways to achieve governance objectives. These are framings that center on the advantages of international good practices and regulatory interoperability. We have regulatory framings that address measures to ensure technologies are developed and can be used in ways that protect fundamental rights, support innovation, fair competition, and enable sustainable growth. But also central to these regulatory framings is the question of state control. So there's more than one angle, especially if we consider the countries that would fit into the Freedom House not free box when it comes to what fundamental rights are receiving consideration and also what constitutes the basis for fair competition. And last but not least, we have protective framings that focus on managing and maintaining access to key technology components and related expertise, especially where states consider access of a strategic competitor as posing a security risk. There are many different ways of breaking down the data that we have collected here. I only briefly want to highlight a few takeaways in the time that we have, which is slipping away as I realize. But if you're interested, we have, in exploring this data further, we have a dashboard forthcoming where you can freely explore this data with a bit more patience than we have for our session here today. But for national strategies, as you can see here on this slide, we see a roughly similar pattern. There's a somewhat homogeneous distribution of strategic framings across technology clusters. You can see a focus on leveraging technology, the exploratory framings in light blue. There's a recognition that this requires some consultation, and consultation and cooperation benefit from a clear regulatory framework that establishes legal standards, but also introduces safeguards. But there are concerns that not only require laws, but high walls for protection. So we see all of this represented in the 4 colors featuring essentially for all the technology clusters. If we look at the same for the GDC, we notice that the consultatory framings are very much prevalent for some technology areas like 5G and 6G, semiconductors, for instance. These supply chain dependencies are so dominant that internationally the focus is almost entirely on these consultatory framings. If we break down these strategic framings in national strategies by country rather than technology clusters, this shows us that the homogeneous distribution of strategic framings that we saw earlier is actually not shaped by a shared approach across countries, but rather by individual countries that are adopting a consistent mix of strategic framings across technologies. That's very notable if we look at the protective framings, which have only been invoked by 4 countries, essentially, at least in our sample. That's China, Iran, the UK, and the US. Similarly for the GDC, if we choose the country breakdown, that shows us that while consultatory approaches account for a larger share than for national strategies, the emphasis assigned to consultatory framings differs more strongly between countries than the first overview based on technology clusters would have suggested. Notable examples of this are Austria, Japan, or Singapore here on this slide. These country differences are starkly noticeable if we look at which states are most actively using certain framings. These are leading originators of strategic framings, as coined here on this slide. But the interesting part is the comparison between the national and multilateral levels that brought us to this review in the first place. So if we look at the GDC, and you'll see here marked with stars which countries have featured as leading originators, both for the national strategic documents and the GDC, that there are at least 3 countries that have shown some consistency in the kind of framings that they invoke at the national and at the international level. So if we are surveying for consistent messaging at the national and international level, this gives us a starting point to unpack certain countries a bit further, explore why these are countries that emphasize consistency perhaps more than others do, or how they have achieved this level of coordination. Highlighted here, you find the UK, the US, and Japan, and woefully over time, I'll just conclude by saying that we have the dashboard I briefly highlighted coming forth relatively soon. You have the opportunity to already bookmark our news page on the REMIT website, where we will have a post coming out that will probably introduce the dashboard, where you will then have the opportunity to explore this data for yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Can you unshare your screen?
Yes, I'm finding my way to that button.
Yeah, time. I'll be quite quick with this one. This should. Now you should see my screen that I'm sharing. Okay, fantastic. I'll be going through in this like 4 minutes or so we have time for discussion. The second part project that I'll be presenting is a large-scale survey in a number of countries, because we're interested in who the EU can count on in digital governance. Which are the populations around the world that are interested in EU approaches to digital governance versus governance approaches, say, from China or the United States, and why? The research approach for that is we'll be doing a survey in 12 countries, by the end of the year. We'll be deploying this in countries, as you can see on the map, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Georgia, and Turkey. I hope I didn't forget any. And they represent themselves a third of the population of the world. These are representative surveys we'll be conducting. The first pilot study we conducted with financing from the Academy of Humanities and Sciences in Hamburg, with 1,091 Georgians participating. Recruitment was through social media. It was an online survey in Georgian and English. Almost everyone participated in Georgian. And this was conducted in December 2023. The idea is to test methodology and questions, but also to share initial results with people like you. The sample was actually surprisingly good. If you think on the left, or as you see on the left side, this is the sample we have. On the right-hand side, this is the census-based population for 2023 projections by the Georgian Statistical, this better, Department of Statistics. And we have pretty much a match with the regional distribution. We have a pretty good match with the age distribution of the country. Obviously, the age distribution isn't as smooth as if you have 3.7 million people in your data set. We are lacking people in their 80s, unfortunately, but it's fine. I think it's as good as you can go with surveys usually. And we asked people in 5 domains that you can see on here, how much do you trust the EU with digital governance in specific domains? AI, you can go from top to bottom. Social media content moderation. Human rights online, we talked about this morning. AI, cybersecurity, data protection, privacy. And what you see is that Europe is leading in, the biggest trust in human rights among Georgians, and the lowest in AI. It's all very high. So this is all on a scale from 1 to 5, this is all between 3.6 almost to 3.9. So this is all pretty high, and yet it is significant to see the difference, for example, between human rights and AI. Now, if you compare this between, what we call geopolitical competitors or other paradigms of digital governance, if you will, the United States, China, Russia, but also Japan, you see that the EU is most trusted with human rights, followed by the US, followed by Japan, but then there's a big gap. And then with China, then we have Russia. Russia always kind of following the pack here. When we look at the AI, very similar picture, actually. There's small and significant changes, obviously. Now with AI governance, the EU, US are not doing as well comparatively. China is doing a little bit better. But one of the things that we figured out is, there's probably a strong correlation between what people generally think about other countries and how much they trust the government of these countries, right? And if you look at the Georgian population here in the survey, the EU most trusted, followed by the US, followed by Japan, followed by the own government, followed by China, and then there are a lot of difference, a lot of room to Russia. We also wanted to know, this is the part we're working on. We have to work on this because we have to figure out how do we get this strong correlation out. Is that really the right question? This is why we did this pilot. But we also asked other things. We asked people, because we want to understand people's attitudes generally toward the EU, but also toward digital governance. What are people's concerns? Most concerning to Georgians: hate speech, misinformation, bullying, targeted advertisement, censorship, then follow bots, spam, government surveillance. And what is the impact, in your opinion, of social media on specific issues or rights? Is it a decrease or an increase? People think freedom of expression has increased since the advent of social media, freedom of information, hate speech too, and political polarization. So not much of that is surprising. Neither that privacy has decreased. But obviously what is going to be interesting is to look at this in 12 different countries and see the differences there. So what? So there's a methodological challenge we'll be addressing in terms of the correlation to the general trust. The question is, how much do people actually know about digital governance, and how much do they more generally know about, say, the US or the EU or China? But there's a high level of trust generally in the EU and also in different dimensions of digital governance. And the country comparison will help us better understand these dynamics. And then also we'll be doing this again in Georgia, and this is in the currently political climate in Georgia. It's going to be interesting to repeat this a year later and just see differences. Now, we'll be fielding this in 12 countries, and then we'll do the analysis and we derive from there policy recommendations. And now I hope we have still 10 minutes left for our discussants and for the audience, obviously. Mm-hmm. Please go ahead. Do you want to start?
Should I?
Yes, please. If you can do 2 minutes, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll try my best. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and it was really interesting. All the presentations were very much comprehensive. So just to touch upon the Georgia situation, just listening to you, I was very brave of my people, you know, because they are wise. So at that level that they well understand the policy of the country itself. And it is kind of regrettable that we are the family of European Union just left behind, and we are still just reunioning to them. And this is our intention of the country, just to have the same policy and same understanding that the European Union has. And because of that, I think that our population well understand, and it is well just vision and visible from your presentation. So thank you for this opportunity once again. And I would just highlight our just intention, and one of the main what was about the strategies, about the digital development strategies, about the cybersecurity strategy. All are in place in Georgia. So the digital strategy is under progress, just under elaboration, and it will be very soon also, which will consider all the things what you've mentioned. It is AI, it is blockchain, it is IoT, and all the stuff what is digital governance and digitalization. And we are living in the digital era, so it is not very just surprising to be that way. So thank you once again, and I think I've just been conscious of time and will just pass.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Do you want to continue on now?
Well, I have a question. So I think this work will be very important for the European Commission and for the European Commission to propose something to the Council and to the European Parliament. But you mentioned one stakeholder group is multi-stakeholder. How can you have a multi-stakeholder in a stakeholder group? What do you mean by that?
This relates to the documents. For example, the Net Mundial statement, we would code as this is a multi-stakeholder document.
Okay, so because you have all the stakeholders there, so Net Mundial is one of the
and the Tunis statement. I mean, these kind of statements.
But Tunis is multilateral.
Yeah,
it's intergovernmental.
It's a bad example. Yeah, but there's some multilateral, some multi-stakeholder.
Yeah, because I'm only thinking about the Net Mundial.
It's a good point. And also when we have, for example, documents where governments and companies write together, so this already would for us be multi-stakeholder. Now, this you can say several stakeholders is not multi, but we somehow had to code this. And
but I think that my point to better understand the situation and the landscape is to understand what the concepts mean.
Yeah.
So I struggle here a little bit with, well, not with what you mean by digital governance, because of course I understand what digital governance is, but it's a much broader concept that perhaps internet governance, but as it is in the Tunis agenda, internet governance is digital governance for the time being. We will see in the WSIS +20 review what will happen. But the main point here is that the situation is changing, of course, and a lot. And I'm a bit puzzled that still some Georgians believe in Russia and China, but that's the situation as it is, of course. And it will be interesting to see how the landscape will be, well, in 5 years. I think it will evolve a lot in 5 years, much more than in the last 20 years, actually. And all this work will be very valuable for what will be the scene after the GDC and after the WSIS plus 20, because European Union is always being perceived as a body where we are a bit mad about regulation. And it's exactly the contrary, I may say, because what we want is to have all the freedoms, but regulated, because when you achieve your
maybe maturity level of something.
Yes, and you respect the others, and you have to respect, but you have to have your freedom of speech, but you have to respect others, and how you respect others. So the balancing between the freedom of speech and the respect for the others. So it's always a balance here. So it will be, I think that you have all the dots, and you are connecting the dots, and it will be very interesting and very useful as a tool. So, and I understand why it's funded by Horizon Europe.
Thank you, thank you. And it will be so useful to have all your comments and all your help to make it most useful. And I think also the last comment, well, I think very much to Jakob's work, right? How do you code the different things? What does this regulatory actually mean in China versus in the Netherlands, right? Please.
Yeah, so actually, I'm going to pick up on the freedom of expression, because I was really surprised on your first presentation with the clusters and everything, that the freedom of expression cluster was so small. And then, the freedom of expression cluster was small, and there was very little participation from North America. But the US is the birthplace of almost all social platforms, of social media platforms, that we saw later had the most impact on freedom of expression. So I was really surprised to see that, and I would really like to learn more about that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We'll have to look into the data, and obviously, I mean, this is a classroom algorithm, doesn't do everything right, obviously, and even, I mean, the GDC eventually will be in this data set, right? It'll be somewhere, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't encompass also different parts of different discussions, right? So, but it's always difficult to look at this individual documents, obviously, but this is an interesting question to address. I mean, we're running out of time, but I think, can we take one question or two from the audience? Because we haven't involved you so much yet. Online, there's nothing, but there's one question.
When the government reached the digital rights coalition, I wonder, so the title of your research is with stakeholders. But generally, for instance, your research questions include the question of governance. So my question is, I am going to study the views and positions of all stakeholders, which are the government, because in your presentation, it was not obvious how the notion of multi-stakeholders has changed. Now it is the most critical issue. So I'm going to do something about that.
Fantastic, fantastic question. I think we can take a second one, if there's a second one in the audience. I think that's not so much addressed to you, Jakob, right? Unless you want to take that, but I think yours is a state-centric analysis. We do have in the project, I mean, looking at population is something else. It does, you know, includes all stakeholders by definition is the representative population, but it is just the population. In these documents, the analysis of these documents, we have all the stakeholder groups involved. If you, I mean, we can have a look at this later, right? If you look at these small dots, these are different stakeholders. You have states in there, you have civil society organizations, you have individual or academic institutions in there, you have international organizations, and all these, you know, we have 6 categories or so. So you have them all in there. So that study certainly looks at that. And some other studies that we do as part of the project also look at different stakeholders. Again, others are focused a little bit more on state perspectives. And the populations, you can't really put them in one category. They're by definition, everyone representative, but at the same time, non-specific. Yeah. Thank you. Great question. All right. Well, I'll be here. Jakob might also be here still online for a few minutes if you have any other questions. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for my discussions, and online moderator, we didn't have much work for you, Sepa. Thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of the EuroDIG conference.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.